Hey guys, I'm making this video. It's Friday morning on chapter 35. My dog is barking for unknown reasons. I'm sorry. I just was outside for 3 hours. It is the most beautiful day outside. So I'm starting on page 226 in my book, 35, The Plan. A day long, we ate up the road through Montana. We hadn't looked so far on the map, but it was all mountains. We started in the foothills of the Rockies as we left Yellowstone, and all day we climbed up and down. Sometimes the road snaked along the side of a cliff, and the only thing between us and the sharp drop was a piddly railing. Often, as we sailed around the bend, we came face to face with the camping trailer swinging its wide body along the curve. These roads are a dinger, Gramps said. But he was like a little kid riding a hobby horse. Giddy up! Let's get a move on, he said, encouraging the car up the hill. Yee-haw, he said as we swept down the other side. I felt as if I was torn in two pieces. Half of me was ogling the scenery. I had to admit that it was as pretty as, maybe even prettier than, by banks, trees and rocks and mountains, rivers and flowers, deer and moose and rabbits. It was an amazing country, an enormous country. But the other half of me was a quivering pile of jelly. I could see our car busting through a railing and plunging down the cliff. As we approached each curve, I could see us smacking straight on into a trucker or a camper. Every time I saw a bust, I watched it sway. I watched its tires spin dangerously close to the gravel on the road's edge. I watched it plunge on, eating up the road, defying those curves. Graham sat quietly with her hands folded on her lap. I thought she might sleep, especially after staying awake all night, but she didn't. She wanted to hear about PB. So all day long, as I took in the scenery and I imagined us in 1,000 accidents, and as I prayed underneath it all to any tree whistling by, I talked about PB. I wanted to tell it all today. I wanted to finish it. Yay, we're going to hear the rest about PB. On the day after Mr. Berkway appeared at Phoebe's house and told us about Mr. Cadaver, Phoebe and I put our plan in motion. We were going to track down Sergeant Bickle's son and, according to Phoebe, discover the whereabouts of Phoebe's mother. I wasn't positive that Sergeant Bickle's son was a lunatic, and I wasn't convinced he would lead us to Phoebe's mother, but enough of Phoebe's tales had been transplanted into my brain, so Bristol, shh. I apologize about the dog. So that I caught up in the plan. Like Phoebe, I was ready to take some action. We could hardly sit still all day at school. Phoebe, especially, was fired up. She was worried, too. She was afraid we might not discover her mother alive, and I was beginning to share that fear. At school, everyone was still bustling about the journal reading. Everyone wanted to know who had written about the murder. Alex avoided Mary Lou because of what she had said about him being a pink jerk, and Mary Lou avoided Beth Ann because of what Beth Ann had written about the chicken kisses. Megan and Christy taunted Beth Ann and said, "Did you really tell Mary Lou that kisses taste like chicken? Did she really believe you?" And they taunted me with, "Do you really kiss trees? Didn't you know you're supposed to kiss boys?" In English class, everyone badgered Mr. Berkway to finish reading the journal entry that he had begun yesterday, the one about Mrs. Corpse and the body, but Mr. Berkway did not read any more journals. Instead, he apologized for hurting people's feelings by reading their private thoughts aloud and sent us to the library. There, Ben trailed me. If I looked at the fiction section, he was right beside me. If I moved over to examine the magazines, there he was, flipping through one as well. Once his face made contact with my shoulder, he was definitely trying to plant a kiss on me. I knew he was, but there was nothing I could do about it. I could not help it that whenever he aimed his mouth in my direction, my body was already moving away. I needed a little warning. I tried remaining completely still for several consecutive minutes, and during those minutes, I detected Ben leaning slightly towards me several times. Each time, however, he drew back as if someone was controlling him by an invisible thread. Across the library, Beth Ann called, "Sal, there's a spider. Oh, Sal, kill it." When the bell finally rang, Phoebe and I were out of the school like a shot, and at Phoebe's house, we examined the telephone directory. I'm sorry, directory is like a list of phone numbers. "We've got to hurry," Phoebe said, "before Prudence or my father comes home." There were 6 Bickles listed in the dictionary. We took turns calling. Each time he asked for Sergeant Bickle. The first 2 people said we must have the wrong number. The third number we dialed was busy. The fourth, no answer. The fifth was answered by a crotchety woman who said, I don't know any sergeants. The sixth number was answered by an elderly man who must have been lonely because he talked on and on about knowing a Sergeant Freeman in the war, but that was back in 1944. And he also knows a Sergeant Bones and a Sergeant Dowdley, but he does not know a Sergeant Bickle. What are we going to do? Phoebe wailed. Prudence will be home any minute, and we still don't know which is the right Bickle. The busy number was still busy. The previously unanswered one rang, and just as Phoebe was about to hang up, she heard a voice. Hello? She said. May I speak with Sergeant Bickle, please? There was a pause as she listened. He's still at work? Phoebe was jumping up and down. Thank you, she said, trying to make her voice serious. I'll call later. No, no message, thank you. Yes, she said when she hung up. Yes, yes, yes. She was hugging me half to death. You'll have to do phase 2 tonight. That night, while my father was at Margaret's, I phoned the Bickles. I prayed that Sergeant Bickle wouldn't answer, but I was prepared to disguise my voice in case he did. The phone rang and rang. I hung up. I rehearsed my voice and what I would say. I tried again. On the seventh ring, the phone answered. It was Sergeant Bickle. My name is Susan Longfellow, I said. I'm a friend of your son's. I was wondering if I might speak to him. I prayed and prayed that he had one and only son. He isn't here, Sergeant Bickle said. Would you like to leave a message? Do you know when he'll be home? There was a pause. How did you say you knew my son? This made me nervous. How do I know your son? Well, that's a long story. Basically the way I know him. Actually, this is a little bit embarrassing to admit. My hands were sweating so much I could hardly hang on to the phone. The library. Yes, I know him from the library, and he loaned me a book but I've lost the book. Maybe you should explain this all to him, Sergeant Bickle said. Yes, maybe I should do that. I wonder why he gave you this phone number, he said. I wonder why he didn't give you his number at school. At school? Actually, the thing is, I think he did give me that number too, but I've lost it. You sure lose a lot of things, he said. Would you like his number at school? Yes, I said. Or better yet, maybe you could give me his address and I'll send him the book. I thought you said he lost the book. Actually, yes, but I'm hoping to find it, I said. I see, he said. Just a minute. There was a muffled pause as he put his hand over the receiver and called, Honey, where's Mike's address? Mike, brilliant, a name. I felt like a chief inspector. I felt like I had just discovered the most important clue in a criminal investigation of the century. To top it off, Sergeant Bickle gave me Mike's address. I was sorely tempted to end the conversation by informing Sergeant Bickle that his son has a potential lunatic, but I refrained. I thanked him and immediately phoned Phoebe. You're brilliant, she said. Tomorrow, will nail Mike the lunatic. Okay, so they have an address to this person they think is a lunatic. So, anyone want to speculate what they're going to do next? Dun 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 dun. Sorry, I'm moving my computer closer. All right, 36, The Visit. Oh my gosh, getting good. 233 in my book. The next day, Saturday, when Phoebe and I reached the bus stop, Ben was standing there. Oh, crud, Phoebe muttered. Are you waiting for this bus? Are you going to Chanting Falls? Yep, he said. To the university? Nope. Ben pushed his hair from his eyes. There's a hospital there. I'm going to see someone. So you're taking this bus? Phoebe said. Yes, Freebie, I'm taking this bus. Do you mind? The three of us sat on a long bench at the back of the bus. I was between Phoebe and Ben, and his arm pressed up against mine. Phoebe said we were visiting an old friend at the university. Each time we rounded a curve. Ben leaned against me, or I leaned against him. Sorry, he said. Sorry, I said. At Chanting Falls, we stood on the pavement as the bus roared off. University is over there, Ben pointed up down the road. See ya, and he walked off in the other direction. Oh, Lord, Phoebe said. Why did Ben have to be on the same bus? It made me very nervous. It made me nervous too, but for different reasons. Every time I was with him now, my skin tickled and my brain buzzed and my blood rumbled around as if it were pre-clotting. The address we had for Mike Bickle was a freshman dormitory. That's like dorms, college dorms. It was a 3-story brick building with hundreds of windows. Oh no, Phoebe wailed. I thought it might be a little house or something. Students were coming in and out of the building, walking across the lawn. Some were sitting on the grass or benches studying. In the lobby was a reception desk with a handsome young man sitting behind it. You do it, Phoebe said. I just can't. We stood out like pickles in a pea patch. There were these grown up college students, and here we were, two puny 13-year-olds. Phoebe said, I wish I would have worn something else. She picked the lint off her sweater. I explained to the man at the desk that I was looking for my cousin, Mike Bickle. The young man smiled wide, white smile at me. He checked a roster and said, "You're in the right place, room 209. You can go up." Phoebe nearly choked. "You mean we could go right up to his room?" "Sure," the young man said. "Through there," he gestured. We walked through swinging doors. Phoebe said, "Really, I'm having a heart attack. I know it. I can't do this. Let's get out of here." At the end of the hall, we slipped out the exit. What if we had knocked on his door and he opened it and pulled inside and slit our throats? Students were milling around the lawn, and I looked for an empty bench on which we might sit. On the far side of the lawn, I saw two backs of people, a young man and an older woman. They were holding hands. She turned to him and kissed him on the cheek. Phoebe. On the bench was Phoebe's mother, and she was kissing the lunatic. "Oh my goodness, we have found Sergeant Bickle's son and Phoebe's mom. On the bright side, Phoebe's mom is alive, but she's kissing this lunatic. Oh snap." 37. A kiss. 236. Phoebe was stunned and angry, but she was braver than I was. She could watch, but I could not. I assumed that Phoebe would follow me, but I didn't look back. Down the street, I tore, trying to remember where the bus stop was. It wasn't until I saw the hospital that I realized I had missed the bus stop. I ducked inside and was surprised that Phoebe was not behind me. What I did next was an impulse, a hunch. I asked the hospital receptionist if I could see Mrs. Finney. She flipped through the roster. "Are you a family member?" she said. "No." "I'm afraid you can't go up then," she said. "Mrs. Finney's on the psychiatric ward. Family only. I was looking for his son. He came here to visit her. Maybe they went outside. You could look out back." Behind the hospital was a wide, sloping lawn bordered by flower gardens. Scattered across the lawn were benches and chairs, most of them occupied with patients and their visitors. It was a scene much like the one I had just left at the university, except here no one was studying and some of the people wore dressing gowns. Ben was sitting cross legged on the ground in front of a woman in a pink robe. She fidgeted with the sash. Ben saw me and stood up as I crossed the lawn. "This is my mother," he said. I said hello, but she didn't look at me. Instead, she stood and drifted off across the lawn as if we were not there. Ben and I followed. She reminded me so much of my mother after she returned from the hospital. My mother would stop right in the middle of doing something inside the house and walk out the door. Halfway up the hill, she would sit down to catch her breath. She picked up the grass, got up again, and went a little farther. Sometimes my mother went into the barn and filled a pail with chicken feed, but before she reached the chicken coop, she would set the pail down and move off in another direction. When she could walk farther, my mother rambled over the fields and meadows in a weaving, snaking pattern as if she could not make up her mind which way to turn. The we followed Ben's mother back and forth across the lawn, but she never seemed to notice our presence. At last, I said I had to go, and that's when it happened. For one quick moment, we both had the same agenda. I looked at him, and he looked at me. Both of our heads moved forward. It must have been in slow motion, because I had a split second there to be reminded of Mr. Berkway's drawings of two heads facing each other with the vase in between. I wondered just for an instant if a vase could fit between us. If there had been a vase, we could have squashed it because our heads moved completely together and our lips landed in the right place, which was on top of the other person's. It was a real kiss and it did not taste like chicken. And then our heads moved slowly backwards and we stared out across the lawn and I felt like a newly born horse who knows nothing but feels everything. Ben touched his lips. "Did it taste a little like blackberries to you?" he said. So Ben's mother's in the hospital in a psychiatric ward, which means she has something wrong like mentally. So I'd love a little bit more information on that. But now we do know Ben's like not an orphan. He just lives with the Finneys because his mother must be sick and not able to take care of him. And Ben and Sal finally kissed. We've been waiting for that forever. 38. The split. At the top At this point in my story, Graham interrupted. "Oh, yes, yes, yes," she said. "I've been waiting for that kiss for days. I do like a story with some good kisses in it." "She's such a gooseberry," Gramps said. We were churning through Montana. I didn't dare check our progress on a map. I didn't want to discover that we couldn't make it in time. I thought that if I kept talking and praying underneath, and if we kept moving along those mountain roads, We had a chance, Scram said, but what about Peebee? What about her mother kissing the lunatic? I didn't like that kiss very much. It was the other one I liked, the one with you and Ben. I found Phoebe at the bus stop, sitting on the bench. Where were you? She asked. I did not tell her about seeing Ben and his mother. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I was afraid, Phoebe. I was afraid, Phoebe. I couldn't stay there. And I thought you were the brave one, she said. Oh well, it doesn't matter. Nothing matters. I'm sick of it. What happened? Nothing. They sat there on the bench having a gay old time. If I could just toss rocks like you toss rocks, I would have plunked them both in the back of the head. Did you notice her hair? She's cut it. It's short. And do you know what else she did? In the middle of talking, she leaned over and spit in the grass. Spit! It was disgusting. And the lunatic, do you know what he did when she spit? He laughed. Then he leaned over and he spit. Why would they do that? Who knows? I'm sick of it. My mother can stay here for all I care. She doesn't need me. She doesn't need any of us. Phoebe was like that all the way home on the bus. She was in an extensively black mood. We got to Phoebe's house just as her father pulled in the driveway. Prudence rushed out of the house saying, She called, Mom called, she's coming home. Terrific, Phoebe muttered. What was that, Phoebe? Her father said. Nothing. She's coming home tomorrow, Prudence said. But what's wrong? Her father said. What else did she say? She sounded nervous. She wanted to talk with you. Did she leave a number? I'll call her back. No, she didn't leave any number. She said to tell you not to make any prejudgments. What's that supposed to mean? Her father said. Not make any prejudgments. About what? I don't know, Prudence said. Oh, no. Most important, she said, that she was bringing someone with her. That's just grand, Phoebe said. Just grand. Phoebe, her father said. Prudence, did she say who she was bringing? I honestly could not say. Did she refer to this person at all? Did she mention a name? He was getting agitated. No. Why? Prudence said. She didn't mention a name. She just said that she was bringing him with her. Him? Phoebe looked at me. Cripes, she said, and she went into the house, slamming the door behind her. I couldn't believe it. Wasn't she going to tell her father what she had seen? I was bursting at the seams to tell my own father when I got home. He and Margaret were sitting on the porch. Margaret said, My brother told me you're in his English class. What a surprise! She must have already told my father this because he didn't look too surprised. He's a terrific teacher. Do you like him? I suppose. I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted Margaret to vanish. I had to wait until she went home to tell my father about Phoebe's mother, and when I did tell him, all he said was, So Mrs. Winterbottom is coming home. That's good. Then he went over to the window and stared out of it for a long time, and I knew he was thinking about my mother. At night, I thought about Phoebe and Prudence and Mr. Winterbottom. It seemed like their whole world was going to fall apart the next day when Mr. Winterbottom walked in all cuddly, when Mrs. Winterbottom walked in all cuddly with the lunatic. I don't even know where this is going. Thankfully, Mrs. Winterbottom's alive. She's coming home, but she's with a lunatic. Oh no, what's next? 39 is called Homecoming, and it is on page 243. This is going to be the last chapter of this video. I'm sorry my computer's shaking and sitting on top of my legs. So, anyways, 39. The next day, Phoebe phoned begging me to come over. I can't stand it. She said, I want a witness. For what? I just want a witness. Did you tell your father about your mother, Anne? Are you kidding me? Phoebe said. You should see him. He and Prudence spent all night and morning cleaning the house. They'd scrubbed the floors and bathrooms. They dusted like fiends. They did laundry and ironing. They vacuumed. Then they took a good look around. My father said, Maybe it looks too good. Your mother will think we can function without her. So they messed things up. He's very put out with me that I wouldn't help. I did not want to be a witness to anything, but I felt guilty for running away the day before, so I agreed. When I got to her house, Phoebe, Mr. Winterbottom, and Prudence were sitting there staring at each other. Did she say what time she was coming? Mr. Winterbottom asked. Prudence said, No, she did not. And I wish she would quit acting as if it was my fault that she did not say more than she did. Mr. Winterbottom was a wreck. He jumped up to straighten a pillow, sat back down. Then he leaped up to mess up the pillow again. He went out in the yard and walked around in circles. He changed his suit twice. I hope you don't mind that I'm here, I said. Why would I mind? Mr. Winterbottom said. Just as I thought they would all go stark, raving mad, a taxi pulled up outside. I can't look, Mr. Winterbottom said, escaping to the kitchen. I can't look either, Phoebe said. She followed her father, and I followed Phoebe. Well, gosh, Prudence said, I don't know what has gotten into everybody. Aren't you excited to see her? From the kitchen, we heard Prudence open the front door. We heard Mrs. Winterbottom say, "Oh, sweetie." Mr. Winterbottom wiped the kitchen counter. We heard Prudence gasp and her mother say, "I'd like you to meet Mike." "Mike?" Mr. Winterbottom said. He was quite red in the face. I was glad there was no axe in the house, or I am fairly certain he would have picked it up and headed straight for Mike. Phoebe said, "Now, Dad, don't do anything too rash." "Mike?" he repeated. Mrs. Winterbottom called, "George, Phoebe, we heard you say to Prudence. We heard her say to Prudence. Where are they? Didn't you tell them we were coming?" Mr. Winterbottom took a deep breath. "Phoebe, I'm not sure you or Sal should be around for this." "Are you kidding me?" Phoebe said. He took a deep breath. "Okay," he said. "Okay, here we go." He stood up straight and tall and walked to the living room. Phoebe and I followed. Honest and truly, I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away on the carpet. There were two reasons for this. The one reason was Mrs. Winterbottom looked different. Her hair was not only short, but it was also quite stylish. She was wearing lipstick, mascara, and a little blush on her cheeks. Her clothes were altogether unlike anything I had ever seen her in. A white t-shirt, blue jeans, and flat black shoes. Dangling from her ears were thin silver hoop earrings. She looked magnificent, but she didn't look like Phoebe's mother. The second reason that I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away was that there was Mike Bickle, Phoebe's potential lunatic, in her own living room, and it was one thing to think he was coming and another thing to actually see him standing there. I didn't know what to think. For a second I thought Mike had kidnapped Mr. Winterbottom and was bringing her back for some ransom money. Maybe he was now going to do away with the rest of us, but I kept thinking of seeing them together the day before. And besides, Mrs. Winterbottom looked too terrific to have been held captive. She did look frightened, but not of Mike. She seemed afraid of her husband. "Dad," Phoebe whispered. "That's the lunatic." "Oh, Phoebe," her mother said, pressing her fingers to her cheek, and when she made that familiar gesture, Phoebe looked as if her heart was splitting into 1,000 pieces. Mrs. Winterbottom hugged Phoebe, but Phoebe did not hug back. Mr. Winterbottom said, "Norma, I hope you are going to explain what exactly is going on here." He was trying to make his voice sound firm, but it trembled. Prudence stared at Mike. She seemed to find him handsome and was flirting with him. She fluffed her hair away from her neck. Mrs. Winterbottom tried to put her arm around Mr. Winterbottom, but he pulled away. "I think we deserve an explanation," he said. He, too, stared at Mike. Was she in love with Mike? He seemed awfully young, not much older than Prudence. Mrs. Winterbottom sat down on the sofa and began to cry. It was a terrible moment. It was hard to make any sense out of what she said at first. She was talking about being respectable and how Mr. Winterbottom would never forgiven her, but she was tired of being respectable. She had tried very hard all these years to be perfect, but she had to admit that she was quite unperfect. She said there was nothing that she had never told her husband, and she feared he would not forgive her for it. Mr. Winterbottom's hands trembled. He did not say anything. Mrs. Winterbottom motioned for Mike to join her on the sofa. Mr. Winterbottom cleared his throat several times, but still he said nothing. Mr. Winterbottom said, "Mike is my son." Mr. Winterbottom, Prudence, Phoebe, and I all said, "Your son?" Mrs. Winterbottom stared at her husband. "George, I know you will think I'm not or was not respectable, but it was before I met you, and I had given him up for adoption, and I could hardly bear to think of it. And," Mr. Winterbottom said, "Respectable? Respectable? What the hell is respectable?" Mr. Winterbottom did not normally swear. Mrs. Winterbottom stood up. "Mike found me, and at first I was frightened of what that would mean. I've lived such a tiny life." Phoebe took her father's hand, "And I had to go away and sort things out. I haven't yet met Mike's adopted parents, but Mike and I have spent a lot of time talking, and I've been thinking." Mike looked down at his feet. "Are you going to leave?" Mr. Winterbottom asked. Winterbottom looked as if he'd slapped her. "Leave? Again, I mean," Mr. Winterbottom said. "Only if you want me to," she said. "Only if I cannot live with such an unrespectable—" "I said to hell with respectable," Mr. Winterbottom said. "What's all this about respectable? It's not respectable I'm concerned about. I'm more concerned that you couldn't or wouldn't tell me about any of this." Mike stood up. "I knew it wouldn't work," he said. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I have nothing against you, Mike. I just don't know you." He looked at his wife. "I don't think I know you either." I was wishing I was invisible. Outside, the leaves were falling on the ground, and I was infinitely sad down to my bones. I was sad for Phoebe and her parents and Prudence and Mike. sad for the leaves that were dying, and sad for myself for something I had lost. I saw Mrs. Partridge through the window, standing at Phoebe's front walk. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I think we all need some time to sit down and talk. Maybe we can sort something out." Then he did what I think was a noble thing. He went over to Mike and shook his hand and said, "I didn't think I didn't always think a son would be nice addition excuse me. I did always think a son would be a nice addition to this family." Mrs. Winterbottom looked relieved. Prudence smiled at Mike. Phoebe stood motionless off to the side. "I better go," I said. Everyone turned to me, as if I had just jumped through the roof. Mr. Winterbottom said, "Sal, I'm sorry. I truly am." To Mike, he said, "Sal is like another member of the family." Mrs. Winterbottom said, "You're mad at me, aren't you, Phoebe?" "Yes," Phoebe said, "I most certainly am." Phoebe took my sleeve and pulled me towards the door. "When you all decide exactly how many people are in this family, let me know." We stepped out on the porch just as Mrs. Partridge placed a white envelope on the steps. Everyone, let's just talk about that mind-blowing chapter. So the lunatic is Mrs. Winterbottom's son, Mike. She must have had him when she was young, given him up for adoption. Sometimes that happens. And now Mrs. Partridge is leaving a white envelope. And what was in the white envelopes earlier? All of the messages. Cannot even believe this. We only have about 30 pages left of this book. A video coming to you shortly.